very good afternoon to everybody who's tuned in to this event, and a very big welcome and a warm welcome to COVID-19, what's next for the future of universities. My name's Simon Swain. I'm a professor at the University of Warwick, but I'm also Vice President for Research at the British Academy, and I work with my colleagues to do what the Academy does, which is to speak up for humanities, arts, and social sciences. And that's really what we're trying to do today, looking particularly at our subject areas in universities in the era of COVID. Now, the British Academy, just to say a few words about us, is a fellowship of around 1,000 fellows elected for their academic work. But we also do many other things. We put out position papers, we support particular subject areas where we think interventions are needed. And we also work internationally to try and bring the best scholars to the UK. We also fund, particularly with early career fellows, and we give out various other small project grants too. So that's who we are. And today's event really stems from our current policy programme called Shape the Future. Now, what we've been doing in the age of COVID is to mobilise our fantastic fellowship, bringing in fundees as well and other experts to try and think about the immediate challenges of the pandemic and to think about how history, law, economics and psychology and the other areas where we're active can make a real difference to how the UK recovers from the current problems. So whether it's COVID-19, climate change, technology, ageing society, other challenges which can be solved only with knowledge, skills and insights, we want to be there making sure that arts, humanities and the social sciences play their part alongside our colleagues in sciences and mathematics. Now, we've brought our subjects, we're trying to bring our subjects together very much under this acronym SHAPE: Social Sciences, Humanities, Arts, and People for the Economy. This is a way of trying to give a much bigger picture for what we do and to try and make it more understandable how our subjects work together to try and help society to improve and to know more. And I suppose if I was going to sum up what we do in a single phrase, we're very interested in the health of our disciplines, but not just in the universities. We want to see them working for the good of communities and individual people up and down the country, and also both nationally and internationally. Well, this afternoon, we're turning our attention to the impact of COVID-19 onto the university sector itself, where the challenges have been really quite extraordinary, and universities, with the help of many other public and private bodies, have been working extraordinarily hard to keep education going and to try and make a difference in terms of testing and tracing, but also thinking about the economic reset which we all need from this period. And to discuss the issues which are so pressing, I'm very lucky to be joined by a wonderful panel this afternoon. And I'll just say very briefly who they are. Professor April McMahon, who's Vice President of Teaching, Learning and Students at the University of Manchester. I might also add that April has had a very distinguished career of academic leadership in various universities, and brings a huge wealth of knowledge about the sector. We also have Professor Helen Higson. Helen is very near my own university. She's at Aston. She's Provost and Deputy Vice Chancellor in charge of strategy and resources management, so really in the thick of the university sector's response to the current crises. And finally, but not least in any way, Amatey Doku. He's had a very distinguished career already, President of the Cambridge University Students' Union, and then a Deputy President of the National Union of Students. He's worked in various education management and leadership organizations. And I think, Amatey, you will bring a very, very important perspective this afternoon, as it's not so long ago when you were a student, it's a little bit longer ago for the rest of us. Now, what we're going to do is to ask our panel to say a few words each before we move into a chaired discussion for around 20 minutes, and around about 20 to 5, we're going to take audience questions. So please get thinking about what you'd like to ask. What we're going to do is to kind of group things in subjects, and then as chair, I'll put those questions to our panel. The way to do this is to submit questions using the Q&A button on your dashboard. And of course, you're very welcome and encouraged to tweet during the event, and can copy in the Academy's Twitter handle @British Academy. So without further ado, let me turn to our panel, who are going to say a few words for about 5 minutes each, giving their own thoughts and their own perspective on these difficult times. And I'm going to ask April to kick off. So April, over to you, and we're very much looking forward to what you've got to say.
Thank you, Simon, and hello. Thank you for joining the event this afternoon. So I'm going to focus on the experience of being part of a team in a university looking at the effects of COVID on our current working and our future planning in terms of teaching and learning and student experience. So what are the COVID-inspired questions that my team and I are thinking about at the moment? First of all, I think this situation has given us a new perspective on speed and agility and change. Universities are often portrayed, and it isn't always fair, as places where change takes a long time. And I certainly grew up as a young academic on the joke that goes, how many academics does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is change. But universities turn out to be places where you can move really, really fast when you have to. And in future, my question is, how do we keep moving fast? But how do we get really good student and staff engagement in that process, in that speedy process? Along similar lines, we've been able to introduce some innovations, some changes that it genuinely would have taken us a long time to get going if we had been in pre-COVID times. I'm confident of that. I'll give you 2 examples. First of all, we extended our welcome and induction events this year. And not only did we have induction for new undergraduates, but we had a welcome back week for returning undergraduates, and we had a whole host of bespoke induction events, welcome events and activities for postgraduate taught students. And postgraduate taught students often tell us that they feel like the in-between population, they don't have the same focus that our undergraduates or our postgraduate researchers would have. So that's been a really big benefit. We've moved also masses of our exams online. We're doing much, much more online assessment. So fewer sweaty sports halls full of people very stressed, trying to memorize things in difficult circumstances. I'm sure you remember that mode of assessment only too well, as do I. And more inclusivity and more really assessment literacy, thinking what do we want our assessments really to challenge our students to do. So I don't think we've wasted a good crisis in the sector at all. But how do we convince colleagues that the work that they've put into these innovations isn't going to waste now, because there may be a kind of a push back to how things used to be? How do we change perceptions of what the gold standard is in terms of assessment, for instance, and build confidence in what is new? And how do we make sure that the great things we're doing now don't get tarnished with a COVID label, but they're given credit for really being positive innovations? In our first lockdown in March, we kept our well-being, our student support, our student residences open. We didn't close. But in terms of teaching, I have to be honest, there were some areas where we scrambled online rather than moving online in a completely planned fashion. We got there. Students were grateful for the effort that went in, but it didn't necessarily look as coordinated as it might. We are now in a much more designed, blended and flexible learning way of working. And it's that designed blended teaching and learning that I see as the future for us at Manchester and also the future for the sector. Again, it brings questions. How do we ensure we have the best models for student engagement and representation in a blended world? How do we improve equality and diversity? We've done a great job this year in terms of admitting students from a wider range of backgrounds than ever. But we need to make sure we're supporting them because they might have been out of education for quite a long time. And none of this, from the A-level to and fro over the summer to the global pandemic, is the students' fault. They didn't ask to be students at this particular point in history. And the hardest question to end with, how do we develop a convincing, meaningful narrative about both online and face-to-face in-person teaching being valuable and necessary? Because at the moment they're being set up by circumstances as being in opposition. If we say our online teaching is going really well and students love it, we get the criticism that, well, you're only saying that because you can't deliver enough face-to-face under current circumstances. If we say the face-to-face on-campus experience is still really important, we face issues around not being up to date enough to embrace online. Or we get into hot water because we're about to go into lockdown. We won't be able to do just quite as much as face-to-face as we would like. So how do we make the case for blended being those two elements of teaching working beautifully together rather than two oppositional kinds of systems? Thanks very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, April. That really put it in a nutshell, actually, and thank God for the end of sweaty sports halls. I think we can all applaud on that one. Now, Helen, how are you going to follow those sports halls? And please do with your own perspective.
Thank you very much, Simon. And I think what I'm going to cover is a lot of what April's already touched on. So I think the first thing to start off with is university changes your life. And the OECD says you're likely to be healthier and wealthier and happier. And you're more likely to vote, to engage in your children's education, less likely to go to the doctor, less likely to be obese, less likely to smoke. And you'll also earn more over your lifetime on average, and you're far more likely to be in a role that you feel is fulfilling. So at a time of crisis such as the pandemic, it's all too easy for those who are already in a more disadvantaged area to be in a worse position. I think we've all seen this across a number of areas of our lives. And given all this, it really shows how important universities are. And I would say that recently, universities have perhaps not had a good press. And I would further suggest that the pandemic, as April has already suggested, has made us really show our worth. So let me give you some examples. When universities were forced to shut down their campuses in March, within 48 hours, students in universities had to adapt to undertake all their learning online, and also, as we've gone on, more novel methods of assessment to replace face-to-face exams, and the concern that their results and their future prospects would be affected, and that they felt that very acutely. And it was a scary and disorienting time. And nothing was the same for them as before, and they were not getting some of the usual benefits that they were expecting from university education. And there was a possibility that students would have had a less satisfactory experience than generations before it had. And it's been the responsibility of university leaders to ensure that the students of 2021 experience a high quality, engaging and innovative learning experience. And new students often find their first term disorienting, and now there are additional challenges. In order to maintain student satisfaction and to manage expectations, as April has already touched on, universities have had to find ways of listening attentively and new ways of operating. And institutions may have been doing all we could have done to support students, but students haven't always felt or understood what we were doing. And there's been a need to increase the regularity of collection of student views, of their evaluation, of listening and reflecting on these, and also being responsive. And secondly, universities have had to realise that there's no one size fits all. There's no one solution. So some students have said, I'm only going to enrol this year if I can come on campus. And other students have said, I'm only going to enrol this year if everything's online. And so we've had to make sure that we've had a much more personal experience for all. And we've had to design learning which can be flexed either way according to student demand, but also as the pandemic restrictions change, as we've discovered only this week. And this has needed to be done with a new speed and agility that I recognise in my own institution, which April has also recognised. So thirdly, institutions have had to communicate to students more than they've ever done before, and to do so in a multiple set of channels. And of course, we've all got used to email, but students tell us that email isn't the best form of communication. And so something that I think we've learned a lot about is more interactive ways of connecting, such as virtual question and answer session and individual phone calls, replying to specific questions, as well as social media. And finally, I think universities have had to make good use of technology in a way that they haven't before. Paradoxically, it's been clear that a medium that's been a response to having to do things at a distance has often become the means by which universities can offer a more individualised, flexible and engaging experience. And all this may not have been easy for some staff or students. And in the new environment, every teacher needs to be comfortable and creative with the blended technologies that they're using. And they've had to rethink their approaches to designing and delivering and assessing. So as well as resourcing extensive extra hardware and software and networking capacity, it's been necessary to invest in the training of staff. And we've had to ensure consistency, innovation and excellence of design. So 6 months ago, the world changed. 7 months, 8 months ago, the world changed. And with it, many accepted approaches to learning and providing that holistic student experience. And the pandemic has been a catalyst for major changes, but many of them, I would say, have been long overdue. Universities must engage with the need for long-term changes in approaches to methods of teaching and how they listen and how they communicate and how they engage with learners. And I think the relationship with students has begun to change as well. More interaction, more innovation, and certainly more flexibility for individual learners, learning situations and approaches. And I would say, as a result, despite the pandemic, universities will still be carrying out their mission to change lives and will still be one of the best investments that you can ever make. Thank you.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Helen, you've really summed up the vast amount of work which is going on in the sector to try and get around this, but also to think about how we do this better in the future. Now, last but certainly not least, as I said before, Amatey, give us your perspective, and then we will move into a discussion of some of the key issues which the three of you have brought up. So over to you.
Thanks, Simon, and really, really pleased to be here. Look, I'm keen to get into the discussion and the Q&A, so I'm not going to take up too much time. But I really wanted I think April and Helen have really sketched out the things that have been changing on the ground in institutions around COVID, the changes that have had to be made in a very, very short space of time. I think they've articulated them well. And I wanted to give us an opportunity to sort of take a bit of a step back and maybe throw some slightly controversial elements in there as well, whilst recognizing that they've given a very good foundation for this conversation. So I'll just talk very, very briefly about three areas. The first one is to reiterate this point about why this time is important, what COVID has done, and it's allowed us to challenge some of the fundamental assumptions we've had of the world. But the second point to make is that the long-term structural change for the sector is not inevitable, and I would argue that some of the fundamentals for the sector haven't changed in the same way as that they've changed across society. And then that final point to talk about what are the opportunities here to really change the fundamentals when looking at the impact that COVID is going to have on broader society as a whole, and the real need for universities to be up to speed and to take advantage of that. So on that first point, people on this call, everyone will know this already, but globally, some really big fundamental assumptions have really been challenged during this period. The first one being the sort of superiority of the West. Many Western countries have really struggled to deal with these outbreaks in a way that shouldn't, in terms of the way we view the world, correlate with their development. Another thing which has been challenged, this is by no means exhaustive, are the lengths to which the governments have been prepared to restrict the rights to protect lives in the face of a pandemic. These are things that you wouldn't have assumed that governments would do, but we're certainly in that territory at the moment. Nationally, we know how we work, the way we work, working remotely, that's been challenged. Who are important in our society in terms of key workers, the NHS, how we interact and socialise. If you told me a year ago that the government would be planning to shut down pubs for a month and there wouldn't be a riot, I would be shocked by that. But we've done that before. We did it for about 3 months and we all survived. So some real fundamentals have changed. For the sector, again, some fundamentals have been challenged. How we work, the fact that we can work effectively at home, the speed at which, as April pointed out, the speed at which decisions can be made in universities, and the communications to students as well. That's been changed and rapidly changed very quickly as well. And that point, as I said, about how quickly changes can be made across institutions, the assumption that it takes years and years and years for any change to be made, that the pandemic has demonstrated that that's not necessarily the case, that when that external context is there, those changes can be made. But I think the second point I want to make is that I do want to make the point that I don't think the long-term change is necessarily inevitable. And whilst I do think there have been big changes to the universities and the way in which they've uh, uh, acted and responded during the pandemic, I don't actually think that some of the fundamental questions about how it's structured, about delivery, about what the offer is for students have changed. So we're not really asking questions around the 3-year residential model really coming out of this. We're not really asking questions about whether or not our lectures the best way of delivering teaching. In fact, both students, the government, and to some extent universities are lots in this conversation around value for money and saying it's not fair on the one hand that I should be paying £9,000 for lectures, but nobody's actually stepping back and saying are lectures the right way of delivering this content. Same about examinations and assessment. What we're doing is we're shifting to more digital forms of assessment and things like that. But we're not always across the sector. I know lots of institutions are doing that individually, but across the sector, we're not having the conversations about examinations and whether they should be the right way of delivering that education. And a lot of the conversation has been around, things that we've wanted to change for a long time, whether it's around digital, whether it's around ways of working, not working in silos, whether it's around communications, whether it's about sort of certain innovations in teaching that we wanted to do for a long time, which have always been there, that have moved forward a couple of years. But in terms of the fundamental delivery and the way in which the universities are structured, that doesn't necessarily appear to necessarily at the moment be on the table. And that isn't me saying that I'm not recognizing the significant changes that have happened, but I think we need to be careful about saying that, universities have completely changed. And actually, I'd credit that to their resilience, actually. I think part of the reason why that has happened is because we haven't seen a significant number of universities completely go to the wall during this time, and universities aren't having to completely reshape their business models and the way they work as a result of that. So partly because of their resilience and their ability to adapt, that we've managed to keep the show on the road. But I would say that some of those fundamentals haven't been challenged. And why is that important? That final point, which I'll kind of whiz through, particularly when we look at Gen Z, who will have another sort of 50, potentially 60 years of working, are we really equipping them with the skills, with the knowledge, with the tools they need to deal with the world that they'll be facing? And if COVID has done anything, it's highlighted the impact of globalization on the world, the fact that we are more connected, and really raised to the fore some of those things that we should be thinking about. So things around the attitudes and demands of Generation Z are very, very different. There's a tendency at the moment to think about the current traditional model of higher education and how can we better communicate that to students, rather than thinking, well, actually, they've come in as digital natives with completely different expectations of what they need from and what they want from whether that's from Netflix or from other apps and things like that. They have a completely different way of taking in information and making decisions. And are we really understanding on what those issues and concerns are there? We've got climate change. We've got the political challenges of East versus West. We've got a rapid demand and increased provision for HE in the global South, automation, AI, and the future of work. And I should have sort of prefaced at the beginning, I'm currently a consultant at Nous Group, and we've done a lot of strategy work with universities. And what's really interesting is being able to do some of that scenario planning with universities to test the scenarios against some of these potential scenarios in the future and say, is the current strategy set up to deal with a world where there may be another pandemic, where climate change is going to be a significant issue, where the automation and AI has huge implications for the future of work. And there are some immediate things I think the universities sector can be doing, and certainly should be doing around the impending economic crisis that is set to be in train. But taking that much longer view, I think, will put us in a much better place to ensure that universities continue to be invaluable to society. But I'll leave it there and look forward to the Q&A.
Amatey, brilliant. You've done what I hoped you'd do, which is to take us out of the academy a little bit, and also to remind us not to slip back into our old ways, many of which are undesirable, and it could all too easily happen. And I think if I was going to be very crude and sum up what the three of you have done, if Amatey, you've taken us out of the academy. I think Helen and April, you talked about how the academy is changing, how it must continue to change. If we put the three of you together, I think we've got a very good recipe for sustaining all that agility and energy, which has half killed some of our colleagues and tested our students really severely, but which could actually really be channeled into something fantastic. Now, questions are coming in, but let's have a little bit of a discussion amongst ourselves and see whether we can get our audience to give us some difficult questions. Now, I've got two children at university at the minute, and they've both been on the phone saying, why should I stay in my room for the next month, just because Boris said so, and do all of my lectures online? And they are not at all happy about this. And I wonder whether we could just talk about well-being in this immediate month going ahead, because it's really testing. And they're really quite worried about not seeing enough people and being a little bit on their own. So perhaps any of you would like to, three of you would like to dive in and just answer my children's inquiry. Why should we stay in our rooms and do online for the next month? We're not getting anything out of it anymore.
Happy to
Helen,
dive in.
Yeah, dive in, please.
I spent the morning thinking about this. Going to university is a holistic experience. It is what you do in more formal learning settings, what you do in more informal learning settings, and what you do out of any sort of learning settings. And so one of the things that it's been challenging, but it's been a good challenge, is to think about how you can make sure that you build up those skills that everyone needs for life while people are essentially on one campus. And I think that doesn't mean staying in your room. I'm sure the academy would be really good to know that the centre of life in my university is the library. The library has been open all any sort of lockdown. It's been open, and it's been the way in which students can go in and meet other students in a socially distanced way and find books and online materials, but also engage in a range of activities that are beyond the curriculum. And I suppose if we can leave our students with anything as an experience from the current situation, is their ability to be resilient and to use resources beyond those that they are used to. So I'm afraid that is my rather perhaps I've got rose-tinted spectacles on, but that's what I'm trying to do.
Right, that's a wonderfully optimistic message. Can I just turn it around slightly and think about the general way in which we look after students, particularly first-year students? It's been very, very tough for them coming this year. And just thinking about the way in which universities for the future, so take some of the general things we've been talking about, are going to improve the well-being and the experience of students. These are things you must all be thinking about very, very seriously.
And Simon, I think, if I may, I think it speaks to as you said, some broader questions around how students are supported in their journey through education, and also understanding that that's a holistic process, that it isn't just about the education in one space, and then well-being in another space, and then extracurricular in another space. Students come to university and have an experience all those things at once, simultaneously, in parallel. And the way in which the university views those students and all the different functions of the university must also view those students in that way. In regards to your particular point about this time, I think the reality is that students know, because they can see what's happening around the country. They know how difficult and how challenging the situation is. But I think sometimes what is missing is that real empathy, which I'm not saying is lacking on behalf of the individuals who are running around and trying to make this work, but taking a step back and saying, actually, what students want to hear is that their experience is heard, and that the institution understands the challenges that they're going through and understands how difficult it is, and is doing everything that they can to get them through it. And that it looks like, and again, this is always very difficult to resource, but you've got to really think about, how are we checking in on our students? How are we making sure that if they've got ideas about what could be improved and how they could do things in a socially distanced way, that is coming through and feeding into the process as well, so that there's a bit more of a collective ownership over the challenges that are happening, giving students a bit of a stake in it, rather than the sense of, well, I'm just being told to stay in my room and that's it. And it's very easy in that context for students to slip under the radar, for those issues and concerns not to be brought to the fore. And my real concern would be if there isn't a live mechanism on a weekly basis, really capturing and checking in and understanding what are the day-to-day live concerns that students are having as the picture changes, and there isn't a way for the institution to respond to that. There'll be a lot of things that will be going under the radar, and lots of students will be falling potentially through the cracks during this period.
Amatey, thank you. Can we broaden this discussion out a little bit and think about the really peculiar thing about the UK and the American system, which is a lot of our students come from elsewhere, and then they go and live out amongst unsuspecting communities who are complaining a great deal at the minute about possibility of infection. But the living out at this time is actually, I think, has particular challenges. I see that professionally as well in terms of being a parent. So I just wonder whether we could think radically, and that model of students travelling from a long way away to go to unis, and then being pretty well left to fend for themselves from year 2 onwards. Is that something we want to think about? It's not all unis, and we've got some different experiences here. And Helen, I'm looking at you. I think a few Aston students may be fairly local or regional. I think maybe April, you want to come in, and Manchester is a place where people come to. I've got a niece there who's come a very long way. She's come from France, so there she is. Is this really the right model for education?
Well, if it's not the right moment for education, what is it the right moment for those young people? And I'm not saying, oh, well, come to uni anyway, because there's nothing else you can do. I'm saying, shouldn't we be encouraging those young people and not so young people? Don't put your life on hold for a year. Come and be part of this. Come and help us shape it. And I think we've already heard a bit of a rallying cry from Amatey, and I think this is exactly right. Where's student voice in this? Because if students feel that they're active agents in helping us to understand how to resolve some of these issues, then we'll all get on a lot better. So just to give you one example, my favourite thing this week has been students saying to us, okay, we've got a lot of our classes online at the moment. We've got a fair amount of face-to-face, but we've got some students who've got most of their classes online at the moment. They said, but we want to meet each other. We want to go to our online classes together. Yeah. So we put our heads together and say, well, I wish we'd thought of that, but how will we do that for you? So we've got some teaching spaces not being used at the moment. We've made those available for students to book in small socially distanced groups. And they actually are attending their online tutorials together in that space. And that is working extremely well. Our library has put on a virtual reading room where you can go in there, you can go in a quiet space or a noisy space, you can talk with other people. There's even a tea room in there that you can go to with your cup of whatever it is you fancy from your room and actually have that interaction. Now, none of that's perfect, but it is really interesting in terms of shaping the models that we've got for the future. I do still think that there's a huge amount to be said for the on-campus experience, for people living with people that they don't know, who come from different places with really different experiences, and making something not just viable, but massively exciting, and horizon broadening out of that. And part of that is living in a house with people that you don't know terribly well and having to figure out budgeting and bills and all the rest of it in different communities in your second year. So I think there are ways that we can make the in-person component and the online component speak to each other and build experiences. And we had an employer saying to us this week, who'd been doing some interviews with our recent graduates. I used to ask questions only to people when they were in about their fourth job and they'd been promoted several times. Questions about how have you coped with something that's gone wrong and how have you learned from that? And he said we're getting fantastic questions from fantastic answers rather, on that sort of question from 21-year-olds this year. So it's helping students to understand and articulate well what these experiences, which none of us would have asked for, how can we use those experiences positively?
Thank you very much, April. Now, we've been in the academy and we've also been out of the academy. And one of the things that universities have been doing in the time of COVID is an extraordinary amount of work with local economic and agencies and public authorities, national health, local government authorities. We're learning a lot because of the things we're doing. How can we stick to doing that and help? And I'm looking at Amatey, you were on the Civic Universities Commission. And that's really tried to bring universities' input into their communities together and take it on a new level. How can we learn from what we're doing now and actually continue to be really at the service of society?
Absolutely. And I was talking to a university in London actually who said that they've never spoken to their local partners more than during these last couple of weeks. And I think there might be a subtle bit of strategic changing the names of some of these groups from COVID planning or whatever to just this is our partnership group and keeping up the frequency of communications, because I think there's huge value in that. You may have seen the UPP Foundation report yesterday looking into levelling up and the role that universities can play there. And I think there's really something which I think is sometimes missing in the dialogue, and was certainly missing in the dialogue around the support that universities needed around the pandemic, it was very much pitched as a sort of, this is how valuable we are to you. We are potentially facing a loss of funding. Please, can you help us bail us out? Rather than saying, no, this is the value we have to you. This is what we can do additionally with this extra funding. And this is why we're such an integral part of our society. Make an investment in us to invest in broader society. And I think that's where the conversation needs to go around this civic engagement. And we need to get to a point where universities are invaluable, which they are obviously at the moment, but they need to be seen by the local communities as an invaluable part of them, so that as far as their long-term financial and long-term sustainability, that is absolutely crucial. So this is a real moment to do that, and there are so many challenges, if not more than before the pandemic. There's so many challenges which universities are very well equipped to be supporting their local communities with, and they need to seize the initiatives in that front.
Fabulous, thanks. Now we've got some questions which have been coming in, and we've been trying to do our best to group them in intelligent and interesting ways. And perhaps we could just go on with the discussion, but taking account of some of the remarks which are in my chat bar there. And let's talk about the most important thing of all, which is university finances. Universities have quite odd financial models. They're really big redistribution machines. Certain universities, business schools make the money, and it pays for the chemistry labs and so on and so forth. Do we need to learn from what's going on and the really serious thinking which our finance officers are doing around how we actually fund universities, what the public role of funding universities is, as well as the way universities operate internally? Many of you must have been thinking about that, and our three panelists certainly have been. So Helen, you're nodding there. You've got resources under your wing, so tell us about it.
Well, I would start with what Amatey was saying about partnership. And certainly in our region, where we have 5 universities within the city, what we've been looking at is how can we help the city to come out of the issues brought from the economic crisis and the pandemic. And in partnership with the local politicians, with the local area partnership and the combined authority, and also with anchor business institutions, we're seeking to work together to try and see our way through that. And this is of course something to do with our sense of purpose in the city, but it's also, this is going to be one of the new models of provision of services for universities. We increasingly need to use our knowledge and skills to be able to solve the intractable issues of society. And I see this partnership as a way of leading to a new model between universities and their funding and the sense of place.
What about that? Turn it to the value for money for students, and should we be thinking very radically and be offering students 2-year degrees, which would cost less? Is it worth having that conversation?
Sorry, I mean that whole 2-year degree thing is interesting, but it's challenging. If we think about the 2-year degree model, and I accept that it works very well in some places and for some students, one of the issues that we find with that model is that students who might be attracted to a shorter degree because they can get into employment earlier, actually really struggle, especially if they're from a more disadvantaged background, because they can't do things like work in the summer. They can't do things like try and get internships in the summer, either inside or outside the university, that will actually help and support them in the networking that they need to learn to do and that they need access to. And a lot of the time that is spent reflecting on what you've learned and actually consolidating that well and applying it to the things that you're doing outside the academy, you don't have that scope. That's not to say that there are not flexible models that we can adopt, but compression might not be the most sensible flexible model. I do think we have to be looking at what else we can provide for our students in terms of employability. What about micro-credentials? What about studying beyond your core programme? what about work experience that's actually ring-fenced for students from with certain characteristics from certain backgrounds who really could benefit from that most? What about linking our students up with alumni? And what about looking again at part-time and block learning that can be done alongside being in the workplace, which is a really big deal for workforce upskilling for some of our master's students, for instance.
I think these are really important issues, and students in humanities and social sciences definitely want the sort of things which you've just been talking about. Now let's take that in a slightly different way, because we've got a few questions around Brexit. You knew that would be coming, and whether Brexit and COVID together are going to finish off the sector, or actually see the rebirth and renaissance of the sector over the next 5 years. Any thoughts on that? And you might want to angle it around student employability, but you might also want to think about academic curriculums and what we actually do as universities. So, Amatey.
And I think that point sort of, if I could just build on April's last point, is that actually a lot of this conversation that we've been having today has focused on the 18 to 21, 22 residential student. But if we look at the way the world is going, if we look at the significant number of jobs that we have at the moment which could be automated, there could actually be a real opportunity here for the whole concept of a student to completely change, and for everyone potentially. And you know, if this conversation has been this debate has been going round and round in circles, but in a sense, there hasn't really been the real impetus for it. But we could start to see the need for this in the next couple of years' time. It could be that everybody, hypothetically, is affiliated to a university potentially in some kind of subscription model, where it is expected that as you transition between work, as you move from one industry to another, the natural route is to go to the university and see what's on offer there, and that model for learning and teaching is incredibly flexible, and that actually that 18 to 21 residential student is only a part of what universities do. Actually, they are embedded in society's upskilling, retraining, and that's just a normal part of what it means. And that could be really interesting from the point of view of what universities could become even more than they are now. That all these challenges that we're having around engaging the local community, you know, what we're essentially doing is trying to engage them in the structures that we have at the moment. Well, what if actually they are all, in a sense, individuals who have access to services, have access to support, and they're all learning in different ways. And that could be a really interesting way that universities could really embed themselves within broad society, become that central hub for learning, for upskilling, for retraining. And the key thing, I think, for the sector to do is to get there before the government try and set up something else which does what they really should be doing, or really have the capacity and capabilities to be doing. And it comes back to that point of funding, making the case to government that an investment in the sector is what we need, rather than sort of bailouts to kind of cover the costs of what we're doing. Actually, you invest in us and these are the returns that you'll get, and this is the new kind of settlement that we'll have with the rest of society. That's part of what the civic agenda is also trying to get us to as well.
Analysts feel to actually have those debates. So we're just talking to ourselves. We're going to do it through the brilliant British Academy Shape the Future series. How do we actually widen things so that we get the voice of students, our employers, but also paymasters? Very important to not let go the fantastic agility and different sort of curriculums which we've been providing in the last 6, 7, 8, 9 months. How are we going to actually have those debates and actually make something last and may have an impact?
So shall I have a go?
Have a go.
Well, I suppose the first thing is we need to shout about what we're about. We need to shout about the difference that we are making to individuals and to organisations and to society locally and nationally and internationally. And sometimes I think universities have not been good enough at actually spelling out the difference that they're making. And that's what I suppose I was trying to say at the beginning of my piece. We do a lot of work around changing lives. We can do even more. And I think we can do better, as Amatey said, if we do that in partnership, both with other people outside our organisations, but particularly our students.
April, do you want to come in on that?
I think this is a really challenging one, because at the moment we're in universities, we're desperately trying to do the right thing for students and for local partners right now, when it feels as if everything is shifting every 10 minutes. And at the same time, we're trying to have that longer term perspective about how can we shift and reshape the agenda about what a university is and does, and who it plays with, you know, to make things better in the longer term. And it's so important that we keep encouraging each other to keep our heads up and look at that longer term, because it's so tempting to get mired in the immediate crisis management. And actually, there's something horribly addictive about that you can go to work and you can think, I fixed a thing today, and feel that that's been a success, when actually the bigger success can be being more reflective and looking at things over a longer horizon. So I haven't given you any insight into how to do that, I fear. But I am giving myself a bit of a pep talk about making sure that I look upwards and outwards as well as inwards and downwards.
And we'll be asking you in 6 months' time whether you've done that or not. So watch out. Now, I've got a couple of questions about careers within universities. And naturally, people are very anxious about that. Many universities, short-term teaching contracts have been cancelled. Pathways for graduate students, you mentioned, April, a PGT, are really not so clear as they were a year ago. What kind of things do you think we can do, learning from COVID, about the way in which we educate the next generation of academics, particularly in humanities and social sciences? Helen, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so we've been reflecting very much on what it means to be a PhD student, and I think the current situation has helped us to think more widely about the future of PhD students, making sure that actually they are trainee academics, trainee employees in companies, trainee leaders of the third sector, for example, and trying to think of a wider set of skills to give them, but also thinking more creatively about the funding of the students, because some of them have been in particular dire financial straits during the pandemic, and it's not sustainable to fund the future of the academy in the way that it has been in the past. But also, we probably need to see a PhD beyond the PhD and the piece of paper and the thesis in more of in a wider way. And for example, we've been trying to develop the entrepreneurial skills of our PhD students. How can they patent that idea that they have, or how can they link up with a partner who can actually develop what they've been thinking about?
Thank you. Now, the bad news is that we are rapidly coming towards 5 o'clock. which is the witching hour when we have to stop this event. So I just wondered whether I could go around the three of you and ask you for words of wisdom about the future of universities. What do you want to leave our audience with? It's got to be upbeat, hasn't it, and interesting, but actually don't be afraid to talk about the problems. So just very briefly, Amatey, one sentence on what universities need to do.
All I say is that I think the HE sector has, within its capabilities and within its with the brilliant minds that it houses, the solutions not only to their own problems but to the problems facing the world as well. And the key thing is taking advantage of that, harnessing that, getting that message out there, and then driving that change. There's a huge potential there, but it needs to be seized upon.
April, would you like to give us a word or two of wisdom? You've given a lot.
For our welcome and induction events this year, we said to students, be curious, be connected, and be courageous. And if universities can take this opportunity, and they're all C's, so it matches COVID beautifully, to be curious and connected and courageous and actually express that to the wider world, we can't go wrong.
Fabulous. Helen, final thoughts from you.
Linked with that, I think universities sometimes forget what they're there for. We've had a really big reminder in the current situation. If we can keep looking outwards, I think that we'll do even better than we've done before.
Fabulous. Now, a very big thanks to all of you. We've only scratched the surface of this problem, have we not? And we could certainly come back again and keep on talking about this. And the good news is that the British Academy will keep on talking about these things. We've had a very good discussion of important issues. They're not going to go away. And everybody has good thoughts on these. That's why I think we need to keep that debate going and to think about how we're going to capture the debate and take it forward. And Amatey, you know how to play to the audience by saying, let's get there before the government does. There was a lot of applause on the Ethernet when you said that. The British Academy's website and social media channels are the places to go to find out more about our Shape the Future policy programme. So do keep an eye on all those things. And do keep safe and happy and thriving in your own universities. There's been a lot of very practical things which I've heard here, which are going on in the sector. And we are resilient. We will keep on going. Let's not slip back into some of our old practices, because I think that was really a very valuable point, Amatey, that you made when you gave us your talk. So on that note, as the comedian Dave Allen used to say, may your God go with you, and we will see you soon at another Shape the Future event. Thank you very much indeed.